Good evening. I should say Sholom Aleichem. It's good to see you. This is a wonderful evening. We're going to be talking with Jeremy Dauber about his new book, The Remarkable Life and Afterlife of Sholem Aleichem. I'm Jonathan Brent, and I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute. And before getting on with today's program, I do want to say that I just returned, in fact, this evening from Kiev. And in Kiev, I visited Sholem Aleichem's house. And in Sholem Aleichem's house, which I understand is not his actual house, there is a museum. And this museum makes you truly grieve for the lost legacy of the great Jewish world of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. The walls are more or less bare. There are a few photographs. There is a pittance of information that one can get, real information about Sholem Aleichem. There's a combination of kitsch and misinformation on the walls, and one sees in it, I see in it, the disastrous neglect of this great legacy that we have, that they have there. In fact, the whole experience of Kiev for me simply reaffirmed the importance of the work that we are trying to undertake here at YIVO. And to part of that being to establish contact with institutions in Eastern Europe for the purpose of joint programs, for the purpose of trying to reconnect our narratives. From the Sholem Aleichem Museum, I went to the Vernadsky Library. And in the Vernadsky Library, there is the famous collection of Ansky and the Ansky expedition. And I look in these folders, and I must tell you, your heart breaks when you look in these folders. They're in brown, acidic paper. And they have no money to do anything with them. But what is even in a way worse is that these precious materials, and I was in Kiev initially because it's the 100th anniversary of the Baylis trial. And some of you perhaps know what that is, others of you may not know, but it was the last blood libel trial in Europe. And so there was a conference put on by a great Ukrainian Jewish magnate, Alexander Feldman, who invested at least $200,000 in this conference. And about 3 blocks away, Ansky's manuscripts are disintegrating. And what are these manuscripts? Ansky's record of the Baylis trial. He went every day to the Baylis trial. And in these folders, you see him copying out what he saw and read. There are sections of his diary. There are poems. There are stories. There is journalism that has never been published. That's the amazing thing. That has never been published or translated, and it is sitting there. And part of YIVO's task in going forward is to imagine what we can do with these materials. And our hope is that we can raise awareness and raise the support necessary for preserving this heritage. It is not simply the heritage of Jewish Ukraine. It is our heritage here in this building, because we have another part of the Ansky collection here on our 12th floor. It's a communal heritage. And one thing, and I don't want to go on for too much longer, but one thing that has impressed me a great deal about the nature of a lot of our thinking about the Jewish world is a loss of a sense of the communal nature of our identity and our history, and a need to preserve this, whether it is in New York or in Lithuania or in Ukraine or in Moscow or in San Francisco or Chicago. Enough said on that gloomy note. Which is not so gloomy, actually. This program this evening is a preview of our winter program in Ashkenazi civilization for 2014. This program will run January 6th through the 23rd, 2014. We've established a winter program of mini courses that last for 3 weeks, very intensive, on a variety of subjects. I myself will be teaching a class called The Other Sholom Aleichem, because frankly what appeals to me a great deal is how against the grain he was in many things. Maybe we can talk about that tonight. Adam Kirsch, who is with us tonight, will be teaching New York Intellectuals Revisited. Other courses include Soviet Jewish Literature with Gennady Estreich of NYU, and Chaim Grada in the World of Lithuanian Jewry with Kurt Leviant. I invite you all to come and participate in these courses. I think you'll find them fascinating. We are very pleased to announce the inauguration of the Jacob Cronhill Visiting Scholar in spring 2014. This visiting scholar is a real breakthrough event for YIVO. We are going to have here on staff for the whole spring term Steve Zipperstein from Stanford University, who will teach courses, give lectures, conduct seminars, and guide graduate students. His public class will be on Jews and the Russian Revolution. For more information about the winter program and a list of classes, please see the back of your program and contact Jennifer Young, our Director of Education. Tonight's event, as I said, is a conversation about the remarkable life and afterlife of Sholom Aleichem. And I would like to invite Jeremy Dauber, the author, and Adam Kirsch, our moderator, to come on stage. And I will say a couple of words of introduction. Jeremy is a professor of Yiddish literature at Columbia University, where he also serves as director of its Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and teaches in the American Studies program. He received his BA from Harvard and doctorate from Oxford. He's the author of a variety of books. I'm proud to say that I published one of them at Yale University Press. He frequently lectures on various topics related to Jewish literature, history, humor, popular culture at the 92nd Street Y and other venues throughout the United States. Jeremy is the author of Worlds of Sholem Aleichem. Please hold it up as a good author, not a boy. And he will sign copies at the end of tonight's conversation in the Great Hall. Adam Kirsch is our moderator this evening. Adam is senior editor at The New Republic, a columnist for Tablet magazine, and has written for the New York Review of Books and The New Yorker. He is the author of a variety of important books, Why Trilling Matters in 2011, also, I believe, Yale. Yes, there you go. On Benjamin Disraeli, and other works. I think we all pay attention to his columns and take his journalism very seriously. He's a remarkable and very strong voice in contemporary Jewish thinking in general media. So let's start.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and I'm very excited to be here to listen and learn primarily about Sholom Aleichem from two men who know him extremely well. And I thought we would start by talking about, I imagine most people here know Sholom Aleichem, at least in some sense of who he was, but maybe, Jeremy, you could start by talking about Sholom Aleichem, the greatest Yiddish writer, perhaps you say in the book one of the greatest Jewish writers of all time. Why?
Well, I think that you can talk about Sholom Aleichem in a wide variety of ways, this amazing writer. You can talk about him as someone who reflected sort of a Jewish world, an Eastern European Jewish world in transformation, who's someone who was able to take that world and put it through a very specific and unique literary sensibility, and yet one that reached and brought together sort of a wide variety of Jews who were beginning to split apart into different factions and ideologies in all sorts of ways. But I think for this audience, one of the other things to think about is not simply Sholom Aleichem as a historical representative and, chas v'chalila, as the basis for simply a theatrical adaptation that would then go on to play in Japan and Turkey, as good as that theatrical production is, but also as a tremendous and remarkable writer, someone with a particular kind of literary perspective, someone who really was able to combine, as the old saying used to have, laughter and tears in a very specific and brilliant way, someone who spoke to the universal traits of the human condition. And that was one of the things that I was drawn to him most, not because he was a great Jewish writer only, although that's true, and not because he was a great Yiddish writer only, although that is very much true, but because he was a great writer, full stop.
Jeremy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Sholem Aleicham's literary ambition, which is an interesting component. He wants to follow the models of Gogol and Chekhov. He wants to write in Russian, but then he turns to Yiddish.
Well, as you say, Sholem Aleichem was always an enormously ambitious person, right? I mean, and he was ambitious in all sorts of ways, but perhaps most so in his literary side of him. He had all sorts of sides, but as a literary person. And he had a number of goals in those literary ambitions. One of them was simply to be, as you say, a great writer on the model of these great Russian writers. Sholem Aleichem came of age in a boom time for Russian literature, Ukrainian literature. And he was imbibing all of those, as well as the great writers of generations past. And I think he felt that why couldn't he be on a par with those individuals? That was one side of things. A second side, I'm not going to say hand, because like all sort of Yiddish things, there are about 5 different hands. The second side was to be an enormously popular writer as well. Sholem Aleichem, both by virtue of his own personality and because of various biographical circumstances, had a deep need for affection, to be loved. And so he wanted to be loved by as many people as possible. And those two things were sometimes at odds with one another, as well as with the third thing, which was to take a language that he loved, a popular language, Yiddish, and to turn it into a vehicle for high literature, as he saw it. To say, right now, at the beginning of my literary career, said Sholem Aleichem, people looked down on Yiddish. They said that only people who would write for serving maids and such would ever publish in this. If you were going to be a real intellectual, you couldn't possibly write in Yiddish. That was something that he wanted to get rid of that sensibility, and he did so in his role as an editor, as a publisher. He published this very influential literary anthology very early in his life with money he got from his wife's inheritance, and of course as a writer as well. And I think while scholars have still remember him in some ways as an anthologist and an editor, it's of course that last component as a writer that made his ambitions fulfilled, that made Yiddish in many ways into a literary language. That would come over a period of time after his death. Sholem Aleicham's literary reputation was not always the one that it is now, but that's something more.
Yeah, I mean, he even calls it a jargon. He calls Yiddish a jargon in places.
Yeah. That's right, and that was a common, as you know, that was a common phrase at that particular time. And he says, I fight for the honor of my jargon, and at the same time, there were two features, I think, of Yiddish that appealed to him. One was that certainly writing in the other Jewish language that he would have felt comfortable writing it in Hebrew, he would have had to, in some sense, alienate himself from himself. He didn't think naturally in Hebrew, and so he had to transform in a way that he wouldn't have liked. So Yiddish would let him sort of speak write naturally. and reflect a panoply of voices that he found so important to reflect. The second was that early in his life, he claims in his memoir that he remembered a scene of his father reading out a Yiddish chapbook to a wide variety of people at a Shalosh Shudas event or something like that, and laughing hysterically. And he said, I want to capture that sensibility. I want that. And the only way in which he could have that experience was in Yiddish. It wouldn't have been in Hebrew, and for other reasons, it wouldn't have been in Russian, although, of course, he was very comfortable in Russian. He was a Russian Jewish intellectual as much as he was a Yiddish writer.
So do you think he had other motives, nationalistic motives in this, as well as, in addition to literary motives?
One of the things that I love about Sholom Aleichem, one of the things I find incredibly endearing, is that he was an enthusiast. And he really seems to have gotten incredibly deeply into a variety of ideas when they came up in the world and when they came to him. So at different points in his life, he was a Yiddishist and a Hebraist and a nationalist and a Zionist and a socialist and even an Americanist for a very brief period of time. And he fully inhabited those identities at the moment that he was inhabiting them. And then when circumstances changed, he would put them aside and move on to the next one. And, some people might say, well, that's sort of flighty and that's this. But I don't think that that's what comes across, as I think a lot of you know in reading Sholem Aleichem stories. I think what comes across is just a tremendous optimism and openness to accepting new ideas and what's valuable about them on their terms. At the same time, I will say this. Sholem Aleichem, despite being an enthusiast and an optimist and an idealist, was not totally blind to the idea that sometimes dreams don't come true. Certainly his own life experiences were testament to that. But like Menachem Mendel or Tevye or some of his characters, just because things have never, ever, ever worked out well before doesn't mean they're not going to work out well the next time. And that, I think, is Sholem Aleichem attitude as each of these possible ideas or solutions to the question of Eastern European Jewry come up.
But toward the end of his life, do you think that optimism remained, or are other darker things coming to bear in his work and outlook?
I was reading somebody, a writer, I think actually it was Stephen King, who I suspect Sholem Aleichem would have admired in certain ways, about how, I think so, we can talk about that, right? But how as you get older, lifting the weight of disbelief gets harder and harder to do. When you're a kid, all sorts of things are easy to believe in, and as you get older, it gets harder. I think it did get harder and harder to lift the weight of optimism and idealism later in life. The collapse of the First Russian Revolution of 1905 and the pogroms that followed it made it increasingly difficult for him to think that Russia would be a hospitable home, although occasionally he had his thoughts that it would be. His failures in America made him harder to believe that America would be a place for people at least of his generation, although perhaps of his children's generation would be a different story. And then I think we shouldn't discount just ongoing financial stress and ill health that in those years of his life did make it harder and harder for him to write smoothly and effectively and just live smoothly and effectively. And that would end up impacting, I think, a tone. So I think some of his last works are darker, but we also have to remember that at the same time that he's writing these dark works, he's also writing the tales of Motel, Motel the orphan, and his own autobiography, which is mixed in this tonally, which is mixed in this way. But these stories of idealism and optimism in other ways, he contained these multitudes in him. Adam, I think.
Well, one thing that I think, since we're here at YIVO and talking about Yiddish, one thing that always fascinates me is the way that in this period, languages and the choice of language had a very specific political, cultural implication, right? So he grew up between several languages. He knew Russian, he knew Hebrew, and he knew Yiddish. And he wrote in all those languages, especially at the beginning of his career. What did each of those languages mean for someone of his generation, born in 1859, is that right? So growing up in the Russian Empire in the 1860s and 1870s, if you were to put those three languages in front of someone, what kind of person chose which language?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that if you were a modernizing Jewish writer, as Sholom Aleichem sort of hoped himself to be, and of course ended up becoming in the 1870s and the 1880s, you really had you had three choices in front of you, one of which was not so much of a choice at all, right? To write in Russian would be to sort of put your lot in some ways with a certain small group of Jews who might be interested, who were more educated, who were more urbanized in certain kinds of ways. To put your lot in Hebrew meant that you were really writing for an even smaller number of Jews, but said that you were a Jewish writer with a capital J and a capital W. And to write in Yiddish was the one that wasn't much of an option at all because it would embarrass you in front of all of your Enlightenment friends. Right, and so that was, and that was one of the reasons why they say that many of the Yiddish writers of this period adopted pseudonyms so that they wouldn't sort of be embarrassed about writing these things. Sholem Aleichem's case was actually different from this, I think, for a variety of reasons we can go into. But these were these different choices that you balanced. Now, Sholem Aleichem, as I've been saying, always loved Yiddish. There's this wonderful line in I think it's in one of his letters, that has a kind of Tom Joad from the Grapes of Wrath like feel to it, where he says, "Whenever there are two people speaking Yiddish, there I am," which I kind of like. I think that's very sweet. And he fights for the honor of Yiddish. He loved Yiddish. But it was very important for him to let other people know that that didn't mean he didn't love these other languages as well. There was an effort that would be, and I talk about this at one point in the book. He comes to Warsaw. There are these big fights between the Yiddish groups and the Hebrew groups about who's going to honor him. And he thinks all of this is silly. He loves Jewish literature, loves Jewish writing, he loves Jewish people in whatever languages they choose to write.
Everybody knows he was tremendously popular. I don't even know how many thousands came out for his funeral. Here in
Nobody seems to know, actually.
Yeah.
There are like 12 different estimates. Yeah.
Like Stalin's funeral. He was the leader, the Vozhd. What was his reception in the Russian press, or in Russian literary circles, or in French literary circles?
Well, it's interesting.
We know that Mark Twain thought very highly of Sholem Aleichem,
right, or at least we think we do. Right, that's right. That's right. I think that in terms of, towards the end of his life, in the last 5 or 6 years, a pair of Russian Jewish brothers, translated Sholem Aleichem into Russian and released his books, and they were quite popular there. And he received a certain degree of critical praise from Russian writers, not just Russian Jewish writers, but Russian writers, as well. I think that what's the most interesting thing about that reception, and a lot of his reception early on, is that Sholem Aleichem was becoming known in non-Jewish circles for his children's stories. Not stories for children, right, but stories about children, about childhood. He was really thought of as a kind of poet of childhood, and this was a way of breaking him to a larger universal market, because there was this sense that, children are children pretty much everywhere. I don't know whether that's actually true. My child is only 11 months old. Maybe, but that was certainly the sense that was out there, and I think that it's not surprising that these were the works that became most popular. And now looking back from the present time, that is not primarily how we think of Sholem Aleichem, right? We think of him as the creator of Tevye, as the subtitle of the book suggests. We think of him as a chronicler of a vanished world with varying degrees of realism. But only in a small part, and for those of you, people here know him much better than others, only a small part of his general reputation, to the extent that there is a general reputation, is on the children's side, which is what broke him in the wider world.
Well, I mean, this brings up or leads to another question about Yiddish, and sort of the great irony about Yiddish literature, which is that, as you say, when he chose to become a Yiddish writer, it was because he wanted to reach the most people he could. He didn't want to write for the elite, enlightened, the masculine, the people who were reading Hebrew literature. He wanted to speak the language that everyone was speaking. Now, 100 years later, Hebrew is the language that has millions of native speakers, and Yiddish doesn't. Is there a sort of... Well, there's obviously some sort of great irony there, but if he had known, if he could have foreseen that, Could he have seen a different path, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that we know that Sholom Aleichem said on the subject of different languages and his reception, his future reception, his posthumous reception indeed, was in his will. And one of the ways that Sholom Aleichem, I talk about this in the book, one of the ways Sholom Aleichem became known to a wider American public was through his will. And it was not a will that simply was, here's where my second best bed goes or whatever it is, right? But it was about his literary legacy. And he says that, and some of you may even attend this, that every year his family and people who love him are going to gather together, and they will remember him not through tearful sort of recollections, but by reading his stories and laughing. Again, turning these tears into laughter. But, and here's the important bit, that reading and that recollection, that telling of his stories, should occur in any language that anyone wants. Right? So he was not dogmatic about this. And I think he would have, and even in his life, this seems to suggest, he would go where the popular linguistic ability was. And as I say, with Hebrew, he was very happy to have his work translated into Hebrew, partially by his son-in-law, I.D. Berkowitz, partially he translated some of his own work into Hebrew. He would be very, very happy to have his work flourish in translation. For him, in some ways, despite the fact that he spent so much time editing and re-editing, looking for exactly the precise words in Yiddish, and he was a master of the Yiddish language, there was another deep side of him that said, the story is the thing, the idea, the tale is what I want to tell, and I know that that's like water. It comes in whatever channels that I can make it at, that are cut into the rock.
We talk about him as maybe one of the fathers of Yiddish literature, but of course, as you know better than almost anyone, there was a lot of Yiddish literature for centuries before Sholem Aleichem. If we were to read him in Yiddish, as you can, and probably most people can't, what about his Yiddish style? How does his Yiddish compare to the Yiddish of other writers who maybe came before him or after him?
That's a great question. I think that there are a lot of features to talk about Sholem Aleichem's Yiddish, but I'll just mention two, and there are many others. Right. One of them is the way in which Sholem Aleichem balanced all sorts of elements from particular regions or specific locales of Yiddish land in order to give the stories a very kind of local feel. So one example that is always fun for sort of my students is if you're reading an American Yiddish text, right? He studs this with all of these words that the Yiddish-speaking immigrant community would use. If it's from Galicia, then they're phrased in a different kind of way. From the Ukraine, in a different kind of way. There's more Ukrainian in some. There's more English in others, and what have you. So that kind of thing. It was said about Sholem Aleichem that he could come to a place on one of his reading tours, and at different points in his life he did a lot of touring. It was said about him he could come to a place and he would talk to people for a couple of hours, and then within a couple of hours he would be speaking that local Yiddish like a native. Right? I have no idea if this is true, but whether or not it's true, it's as they're not telling these kind of stories about everybody, and that was one aspect of his linguistic behavior. I will say that this sometimes led to the idea, particularly in the first years of Sholem Aleichem criticism, that Sholem Aleichem wasn't so hot as a literary artist because all he did was kind of be a tape recorder. He sort of transcribed people's local stuff, and he was like a one-trick pony. That is, I think, deeply untrue and unfair, but that was sort of one of the critical knocks on him at the time. The second aspect of his Yiddish, which perhaps I'm more fond of than other people because I wrote my first book on a similar subject, is the way in which, especially in some of his works, he uses the Bible and other Jewish texts in order to kind of create a work that is not only Yiddish literature, but deeply Jewish literature in that way as well. The most famous example of this, obviously, is in Tevye, who cites all sorts of not only biblical verses, but other parts of the liturgy and certain kinds of Lashon Kodesh phrases in order to give a certain impression, not quite of learnedness, but of engagement with Jewish history, culture, and theology. And I think that gives a kind of remarkable and very difficult to translate without footnotes sensibility.
Do you think Tevye comes full-blown out of Zeus's head, or does Tevye have antecedents?
It's a great question. I mean, and this leads to this wonderful story, which is that, there was this guy, or at least so we believe, right? There was this guy who was in the summer area, right, that Sholem Aleichem summered in Boyarka, who was like a dairy man. And apparently, at least on the evidence of his daughter, Sholem Aleichem loved this guy, whose name was Tevye. And he would, Sholem Aleichem always loved talking to people, and he would carry around this notebook, and he would write down all sorts of things. And the daughter says, we saw our dad talking to this guy, right, and writing all these things down in his notebook. And then, lo and behold, about a year later, here comes this story that's published in a Yiddish anthology of Tevye as he sort of has delivered this material. Now, obviously, this is not what Tevye said. Right? This is not what the real historical milkman said. But there was enough of this that Sholem Aleichem would write in letters to friends of his that you could come to visit me and you could get butter and cheese and milk delivered to you by Tevye. Right, and in fact, that became a kind of thing that people would come and they would go to this to get stuff from this dairyman. And apparently, he at first had no idea what was going on, like why all these people were coming. But then he found out, and first he was a little annoyed that his likeness, so to speak, had been used without his permission. But then he saw sort of that there was some money in it, and he was not upset about that. So, it ended up being a sweet thing. That said, I think. Ultimately, the idea of Tevye, rather than the personality, was not just brand new. Sholem Aleichem, and I talk about this in the book, had previously hit upon the idea of using a regular guy to talk about big issues in Jewish life. He did it in a Zionist short story called Zelig Mechanic. And he had also, in a separate work, hit upon the idea of having a guy sort of use quotations from Jewish liturgy and from the Bible in order to make certain kinds of points. So he had those two elements, but he finally was like, oh, you know what? It's chocolate, it's peanut butter, I guess. They taste great together, And he created Tevye out of that. One of the fun things about writing a biography and dealing with the stories going through time is that you can see certain elements in rudimentary form that then are developed and reach their higher and higher points.
Yeah, Tevye is such a great character. He's sort of the Jewish Don Quixote. He has that sort of stature, and covers a variety of genres, even.
I think that's very true. I mean, we can think of Tevye as falling into a whole bunch of different literary categories. If you want to think of him as an example of as a story, right? If you want to think of him as an example of the monologue, well, boom, there he is, right? If you want to think of him as an example of the generational conflict, there it is. As stories that contain political allegory, he's there too. I mean, almost he encompasses these multitudes in his own way, a very different way, as Sholem Aleichem does too.
One of the things that fascinates me about his afterlife, if we could switch to that for a second, is how he was then appropriated. How Sholem Aleichem, I wonder if you could talk about this a little bit, because it came as quite a shock to me to discover that Isaac Babel, for instance, built a lot of his stories on models that he clearly had gotten from Sholem Aleichem.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I would say that, what is the old phrase? Good artists borrow, great artists steal. And that was, of course, true of Sholem Aleichem, too, as a great artist. He would take ideas from other stories or from episodes that would take place in the newspapers out of real life, and he would use those as the nuggets out of which he would build these remarkable tales. One of my favorite stories, we may talk about this later, On Account of a Hat, Ibra Hittel, which I think many people in the audience know, is built out of a Jewish joke, but it becomes something much larger than that. Sholem Aleichem then himself becomes that nugget, as you say, for Babel, for many other individuals, sometimes unconsciously. That is to say that a Sholem Aleichem story might have circulated and then without its name attached, and the central germ of it becomes the basis of something else. One of my favorite examples of this new anonymity is that Sholom Aleichem writes a song called Schlaf mein Kind, Sleep My Child, about, among other things, going off to America. And within 10 years, it is sort of going around Jewish Eastern Europe as an anonymous folk song, as sort of from the repositories of folk tradition. And I think there's a way in which Sholem Aleichem would have loved that. We sort of said that he's become part of Yiddish land in that kind of way. And there was another part where probably he would have been upset that his intellectual property was being ripped off. So both.
We've heard about a couple of different Sholem Aleichems already, but Jonathan, when you talk about the other Sholem Aleichem, what do you mean by that? Who's the other one?
Well, the other Sholem Aleichem, the one that interests me, the one that I felt that I discovered, though I know it was discovered before I discovered it, but that's all right, is the Sholem Aleichem that is anti-traditional, the Sholem Aleichem that is looking outside of the Jewish world and is actually, I think, attempting to not only very lovingly treat it and describe it, but also to criticize it in rather deep ways. So yes, to me, this is the other Sholem Aleichem because it's one that we don't really talk about that much. It's not the Fiddler on the Roof Sholem Aleichem. It's not what you think of when you think of Sholem Aleichem. So
I think that's very true, and I think one of the Exhibit A in that tendency, and like we were saying, all sorts of tendencies can exist side by side in such a remarkable individual. But Exhibit A, I think, is these stories of Kisrilivka, these shtetl stories, which are sometimes said in kind of not looking at them very closely as, well, it's a town of happy paupers. They're poor, but they're happy. And and it's a much more complicated story than that. And one of the interesting features of the Kisrilivkins is that they are, in certain ways, their own enemies. Whether they're their own worst enemies or not, I'm not sure. They're their own bad enemies, right? Which is to say that any time anyone thinks of a situation that might alleviate the condition of the Kisrilivkins, read the Jewish people, Kisrilivkins talk and they make fun of it and they mock it and they bring it down and all of these kind of things. And that is a tendency that Sholem Aleichem thought not very highly of. In an early letter of his, he's asked to contribute to a Zionist anthology, for example. And he says no for a variety of reasons. But there's a comment that he makes that's very instructive, which is that he says, I love Zionism. I care very much about this. I care much about the idea of a home in Zion. But nothing is really going to come of this because no one is ever going to be able to come together to have enough action to make it happen. The Jews are just not going to be able to make it happen. He would have been, I am quite sure, delighted to have been proven wrong. Right? He died in 1916, long before this happened. But this was his sense of all sorts of Jewish possibility and Jewish action. So that kind of criticism is often not mentioned, but I think it's very much a part of what he says and what he does.
Let's talk, continuing on the subject of the afterlife. Your book is called The Worlds of Sholem Aleichem. Many people here probably know the book called The World of Sholem Aleichem by Maurice Samuel, which in 1943, I think, was one of the books that sort of brought him to the attention of an English-speaking Jewish and non-Jewish audience. And your title is obviously a response of some kind to that. What kind of Sholem Aleichem did Samuel give the world in 1943, and how did that sort of affect the way people saw him, and in what ways was he right and wrong?
My main hope in naming this The Worlds of Sholem Aleichem is that people who are going to buy Maurice Samuel's book would click on mine by mistake in Amazon, and then so that was the no. But I think it is a wonderful book, the Maurice Samuel book, and for those of you who haven't read it, I certainly recommend that it be the second book about Sholem Aleichem you read. But one of the things that struck me the most about the book, written in 1943, this such a fateful time period in modern Jewish history, he says that the audience for Sholem Aleichem and for the world that Sholem Aleichem was created is dying, is vanishing. And he calls it a double dying. One is because he is very open and very aware and very explicit about what Hitler is doing to the Jews in Europe. And the second is that the generation of Jews who thronged, as you were saying before, Jonathan, who thronged Sholem Aleichem's funeral, that generation is dying. An American generation will arise who knows not Sholem, right? Who knows not Sholom Aleichem, and that means that this legacy will be gone, and people will not be thinking about Sholom Aleichem and the world and his world anymore. As it turns out, there are ways in which that's deeply not true, right? And in two ways. One is that I don't think Samuel would have envisioned the wide breadth and depth of Jewish study, of Jewish engagement, of Jewish commitment on the intellectual level of the kind that Jonathan was talking about in his introduction that this place exemplifies along with other kinds of places. And the second, of course, is the popular engagement with a past idea, an idealized and rose-colored idea, be it may, but of Jewish Eastern Europe, in large part, through Sholom Aleichem's work itself, that is or adaptations of Sholom Aleichem's work through Fiddler on the Roof. So I think that Samuel, one can understand in 1943 why there was not reason for optimism, but I think he would have been also delighted to see that things were not as dire or pessimistic as he thought they would be.
And you quote, I forget who it is who says something along the lines of maybe in a review of that book or another essay from that time, that Sholom Aleichem was not a professional writer, that he was sort of a folk figure. And of course, nothing could be more wrong. As your book shows, he was sort of the quintessential professional writer. For decades, he made his living as a writer, right?
That's right. I mean, he was a professional in both senses of that word, right? First, as writing was his business. As it turns out, he was a terrible businessman, but it was his business. And he also was a very dedicated writer. He in fact, had to wear gloves sometimes while he was writing because he was so nervous and intense about sort of writing that he would bite at his fingernails until they would bleed. So he really took this very, very seriously. And yet, because in some ways of his subject, perhaps to a certain extent because of his language, and also because of his way of oral delivery, let's call it, something which he has in common with Gogol and others, people said, as I said before, he really is just writing down whatever he hears or something like that. Which would have been deeply unprofessional, but that's not what Sholem Aleichem was.
So the world that Sholem Aleichem describes is gone. It was destroyed. The people are gone, for the most part, who had a connection to that world. Now, we read Tolstoy today, and we read Chekhov, and we read Shakespeare today because there is a timelessness about their work that is apart from the world and the context, the exact context. There's a universalism. What would you say is universal, if there is a universal quality in Sholem Aleichem's work that will enable it to be read in the future? And I ask this question because a lot of contemporary writers, modern writers, American writers, think that he doesn't pass the irony test to become one of ours in the postmodern world.
It's funny, and we were talking a little bit about certain things before about what Sholem Aleichem says to today's audience, and I was saying that I really believe that Sholem Aleichem is a must-read writer on the fiscal crisis that's going on now. Not only because Sholem Aleichem himself was a businessman, he was a bad businessman, he was a failed businessman, but he turned a lot of his insights into why people are bad at business. Overconfidence, optimism, insufficient hedging against risk, the belief that this time it's going to be different, all of these things into literature. And that makes me think more broadly that Sholem Aleichem is one of our great poets of bad judgment, for lack of a better word, but in the way in which bad judgment can sometimes also be the source of heroism.
So we should get all of the Wall Street hedge fund people to read Menachem Mendel and Shana Schengel.
I think they could do worse. We'll get all the boards of the institutions to kind of, so it's a good. No, I think that's right. In other words, even today, for example, you're hearing people sort of say, well, we've learned from this crisis, right? We've learned from this fiscal crisis we've just come out of. Nothing like, I'm sure everyone has learned their lesson, nothing like this will ever happen again. If you read Menachem Mendel, it's not clear that, Sholom Aleichem believed.
This comes back to about a hat.
Yes.
Because the thing that really bothers his wife is that he writes, without fail.
That's right, exactly. He sends it to the protagonist of Without a Hat, as I'm sure many of you know, sends a telegram to his wife, and that he is coming home for Passover. And as Jonathan says, when he gets there, not in time for Passover, through a series of circumstances that are much more comic and complicated than one might think, his wife really gives it to him. But she doesn't give it to him because he missed Passover. She gives it to him because he added these extra words. And on some level, on a very superficial level, saying, well, you paid a little extra for the telegram, right? You added these words. But of course, a lot of it is about hubris and nemesis, right? You're tempting fate, and then fate is going to come back and get you. And I think there's a lot of hubris out there. There's always going to be a lot of hubris out there. And learning about some of its consequences are important. That said, the way that Sholem Aleichem addresses them is with a kind of generosity and with a kind of humanity, with a kind of vision that also, I think, is very valuable for us, right? In certain ways, not that any of his characters are exactly like Shakespeare's Falstaff, but in some ways they are, right? That there's some foolishness, but they're in the service of a deep-rounded idealism.
Speaking on the same subject, if we were to decide we were going to go home and spend the next month reading Sholom Aleichem, we know about Tevye the Dairyman. What else should we read? And maybe you could also take the opportunity to talk about the state of him in translation in English. Is a lot of his work available, not available?
Yeah. And I want to hear what you guys think also, because here, you guys have favorite Sholem Aleichem stories. So I will say that a tremendous amount of Sholem Aleichem's work is available in translation, of varying quality, but a lot of it is quite good. And I would single out particularly Hillel Halkin and Kurt Leviant, who I know he was teaching one of the courses, as people who really produce fine translations of Sholem Aleichem. There are others who I don't mean to denigrate. Isaac Rosenfeld has an excellent translation of On Account of a Hat, for example. But there are a lot of the great stuff is translated. I think, how many people here have not read the Tevye stories? For those of you who have read the Tevye stories, but probably want to, go further and want to own it if you don't have owned them already. I think Schocken Books publishes a collection by Hillel Halkin. My editor is in the front row from Schocken of the Tevye. I get no royalties from that one, I promise you. Of Tevye and the railroad stories, these Eisenbahngeschichtes, which are set in what you could almost call a portable Jewish homeland, the train, which was a great thing that brought together Yiddish land in this period that Sholem Aleichem was writing, and it is the home for a set of magnificent and remarkable stories. So those would be the ones that I would start with, and then but I want to hear what you guys think.
Well, one that I haven't read but read about in your book and would like to read if it is in English is, and this could lead us to talk a little bit about Sholem Aleichem in America, because of course he spent some time here in America, is the story you talk about 13 Jews who are shipwrecked on an island and they start their own country.
Oh, yes.
And it's an allusion to the 13 colonies of the United States, but it's one of his ways of talking about American society and American democracy. What's that story called?
The story, I think it's called The First Jewish Republic, and it is it is translated, and it's in a book of Zionist stories and works by Sholem Aleichem called "Why Do Jews Need a Land of Their Own?" It's one of the few. It's also in a Yiddish collection, by the way, if I recall correctly. I think it's in the Yiddish collection there. So it's a fun story, particularly because of the ways in which it takes the same thing that we were talking about before of Jews trying to have an idea and then sort of talking it to death over and over again. So I'll give sort of one example, which is that they all decide that they are going to come together and create a republic, but they can't. They all want to be president, right? So they create a confederation. So each of them can be sort of their own president. But then they have to have a constitution, and then they have to argue about what language the constitution has to be written in, and then they decide what dialect of what language and on and on and on, and finally they get taken captive. Because they aren't paying attention to what's going on around them, right? It's a fun story, and off the beaten path. It's a nice journey.
And Jonathan, if we wanted to read about the other Sholom Aleichem, the ironist and the critic, what stories would we want to read?
Well, I would certainly read A Daughter's Grave. I would read the memoir. I think some of the later Tevye stories as well. The real pain that his daughters inflict. And it's real pain. It's not just laughing with tears.
One of the most remarkable things about one of the last Tevye stories, it's not actually the last, but he thought it might have been the last when he wrote it, is about the daughter Belka. And it suggests one of the most horrible things for a dreamer, which is that what happens if you get the dream and it's not what you think that it's going to be. So one of the superficial things that he wants is for his daughters to be financially secure. It's something we want for our children, is for them to be secure in their lives. And she is, or he believes she is financially secure, but she's miserable. And this is the curse of getting what you want. And for someone who always dreamed, that is a very dark and sort of sad story written towards the end of the Tevye cycles. But it's a beautiful and powerful one in its own way too. It's a great choice.
I don't think Sholom Aleichem had a vision that world was going to end in a cataclysmic way. I don't have that sense. Do you?
It's interesting. He dies as a war refugee, right, from the First World War, although of course he wouldn't have called it that then. And he writes on the ship, or he starts writing on the ship to America as this refugee, a story called The Tales of 1001 Night. And you could read this story and you could think of it as a work of Holocaust literature, even though of course it was not. And it has many of the same motifs that we will read later on in Holocaust literature. But all of that said, as dark and apocalyptic and all of these things, as he thought, he had no sense of what the kind of thing that we would think about looking back at Sholem Aleichem now. We invest a certain amount, inevitably and without any choice, about sort of that vanishing of which we have some sense that he felt in his life. So he felt it a little bit, but not in the way that...
Yeah, I think we should get questions very shortly, but I do want to follow up on this for 1 second, which is just to ask the extent to which Sholem Aleichem read and was seriously engaged in the intellectual debate on many of these issues that was taking place around the same time. And I'm thinking of Zhidlovsky, and I'm thinking of Shimon Dubnov, and Achad Ha'am, and so forth.
Sholem Aleichem was a correspondent with many of these kinds of individuals, with Dubnov. He was a friend of Dubnov, with Bialik. He knew almost all of them. He met, for example, or he was at the same conference, Zionist conference, with Achad Ha'am. And so he was very aware and participating in, on a private level, many of these debates and these discussions. I think in a certain way, his interest, although he did have these moments of activism, particularly to help out communities that had been hurt by pogroms or something like that, his kind of activism was looking at the debate, taking the tenor of it, and then turning it into a story that would express the whole perspective, in this way. There's a picture, not a photograph, but an image from one of these individuals of Sholem Aleichem in Nervi, a town in Italy where he was recovering briefly from the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. And it's an image of all of these people who came to his house to see him. And of course, they all get into these huge arguments about the issues of the day. And he doesn't participate. He just sits back and he listens. And you can tell that he's thinking about his next story. And I think that's a nice way to remember him and think of him as, and maybe a nice way to turn it over to questions.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Let's see. Do you want to? Shall I?
Thank you very much. I wonder if you can figure out if he was affected at all by the Zionist movement, which started around the time of his life, and if he ever thought of doing what Bialik and Agnon did and so on, of staying with the Jewish people in their own homeland.
So I just want to make sure that everyone understood the question. The question was, does my biography make a great Hanukkah gift? And the answer to that is, it does. No, the question, of course, is whether or not, to what extent Sholem Aleichem was involved in the Zionist movement, and did he ever think about putting that into actuality in his own life? Did he ever think about moving to what then would have been called Palestine, of course? And the answer is, from a very early age, this man loved Zion, right? He was a huge fan of the Bible at a time when a rising Jewish traditional intellectual would not have spent a lot of time with the Bible. They would have spent time with the Talmud, right? That would have been the book. But he loved the Bible. He carried around a Bible all through his life. He loved the Hebrew literature, the first beginnings of Hebrew literature that focused on Zion, works by Abraham Mapu called The Love of Zion, Avat Zion, and that would quickly turn into a kind of support of proto-Zionist movements like the Chibat Zion and attending Zionist congresses. He did later in life want to go to Israel, to Palestine, to the Yishuv, and he thought about doing it, but by this time, and in fact, there was even some possibility of some of his followers taking up a collection to buy a kind of villa for him around Yaffo. But at that point, his doctors told him that the medical facilities at the time were not sufficiently developed to really pay attention to his tuberculosis. And so he had to stay in sort of Western European capitals and things like that. And he was, generally speaking, he listened to his doctor's advice about things, so he decided not to go. But he always regretted it. He wrote in a letter that he really envied Bialik for the opportunity to do it. So, that it was an unfulfilled dream of his.
In the biography, in the film that was on a couple of years ago, two things surprised me based mainly on my ignorance. One, it said that he began the first literary journal in the 1860s or something, and I thought there were no, really great literary journals in Yiddish before. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. That was number one. Number two, I was surprised because it said he didn't teach his children Yiddish, and I was wondering if you have any ideas about his thinking on all that.
Yeah. First, I had mentioned that Sholem Aleichem, in response to a question by Jonathan, I think, had these literary ambitions, and one of them was to publish, raise the literary reputation of Yiddish, and he did this by publishing this extremely influential anthology called the Jewish People's Library, das Jiddische Volksbibliothek, and he paid top dollar for various people, some of whom had never written in Yiddish, or never published in Yiddish before, to come and sort of publish. Peretz's first Yiddish publication appears in this anthology. So it was a very influential and breakthrough anthology in that respect. When he lost his wife's fortune, he got out of the publishing business. It was a money-losing business for him, and so then he never did again. But in the history of Jewish publishing, he has a small but distinguished kind of place. In terms of the other question about his children, it's a very interesting question. We have letters in which Sholem Aleichem's kids want to be his Russian translators. They want to translate work of his into Russian. And he says, from the letters that we have from him to them, it's quite clear that they are not expert Yiddish readers, at least, right? That they particularly have difficulties with the Hebraisms, right, or the Lashon Kodesh Dika Werter, actually, I should say, probably, in his work. And that he advises this. So clearly their Yiddish was not Sholem Aleichem's Yiddish. That said, we know that he read out his stories to them. We know that we know that they knew Yiddish in some ways. But this was not, they were living in these Russian Jewish circles, and they really, I think, they felt very comfortable speaking a wide variety of languages. There is a writer at the time who sits for an interview with Sholem Aleichem's family, and he publishes a piece that says that the kids don't know Yiddish because he hears them speaking, the journalist that is, hears them speaking Russian. And Sholem Aleichem gets very angry, writes an angry letter to this journalist and says, when they speak a variety of languages, and when people speak to them in Yiddish, they speak Yiddish, and when people speak to them in Russian, they speak Russian, what have you. Given the very diverse and multilingual circumstances of Jewish life in this thing, I think that there is probably some truth to this. But was it Sholom Aleichem's Yiddish? No, and he was aware that his children had different lives than he would ever had and had different experiences. And one of the things he wrote about with kids a lot of times was what is happening to this new generation. What do they know? What do they not know? One of my favorite stories of his, it's not a great story, it's very tendentious, but it's one of my favorites nonetheless, is called Was ist Hanukkah, right? What is Hanukkah? And it's about going to a party in a Kiev-like place, and sort of someone taking a bet that nobody at this Hanukkah party will actually know why they celebrate Hanukkah, right? That it's just an excuse for some gambling and drinking. And suffice it to say that it's a tough bet to win. It's a tough bet,
And one of his grandchildren became an English language author, right?
That's right. Belle Kaufman. And as maybe some of you did, when I was a kid, I read Belle Kaufman's Up the Down Staircase. Anyone read this book, Up the Down Staircase? Yeah, a lot of it, right? And I came to reading Yiddish literature not as a kid, but sort of later in college. And my first thought was, this is Belle Kaufman's grandfather, which is probably not, the conventional thing. But, there it is.
Any other questions?
So Hanukkah came early for me this year. Here we are. I just want to read something toward the end from the publicity with the New World, and I love this. So I'm reading from page 309. Great Hanukkah gift, but you don't have to wait. Recasting Sholom Aleichem stories as American stories while managing to create a saintly, childlike community of oppressed Jews who under their exotic outward trappings are just like you and me. When their real selves emerge, the announcement sounds many of the themes, not to mention the sweetly saccharine and somewhat patronizing tone that will characterize Sholom Aleichem's legacy in the century to come. So, that's like a perfect example of what a lot of people say about Fiddler, but it started so early. So what would you say it was about Sholom Aleichem's work in the American context that led him to be reduced that way, or,
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think that ultimately everybody who appropriates or adapts Sholom Aleichem's work in all sorts of different ways, whether it's simply as in this case, translating or adapting it for an English audience of newspaper readers, right? This is from a syndicated translation of Muttel for the American papers that was in Sholem Aleichem's lifetime, is saying, well, what is going to appeal to my audience, right? And Sholem Aleichem contains such multitudes that there were a variety of things that people could look for. And in this case, these people who felt that this was the aspect of Sholem Aleichem that would appeal to an audience of largely of immigrants, an audience who actually their kids might be involved in buying the papers for them, perhaps, and reading the papers. This might be a way of selling these papers. In a similar way, I mean, and I think the different stage productions of Sholem Aleichem also did this. Soviet stage productions took the class war elements of Sholem Aleichem, theatrical things, and turned those into the main thrust. A mid-century Fiddler on the Roof, took some of the sort of romantic elements and put it into as Irving Howe put it, a softened, sweetened version of the shtetl that could be a nice boy and girl story that could leave, and also a recapturing of lost tradition that could leave everybody walking out of the theater humming and singing. Sholem Aleichem becomes somebody different for all of the people who seek to read him, and that's how great literature is and works.
I would only add to what Jeremy is saying is that at the banquet in Kiev at the culmination of the conference, there was a Ukrainian folk orchestra, and they started out with what they took to be traditional Jewish music, and it was Fiddler on the Roof, which of course is based on Jewish melodies. But
that's sort of like what happened with the poem, right? With the poem that Sholem Aleichem wrote, and then it turned into folk poetry.
That's right. I mean, one of the things that Sholem Aleichem loved was this sense of tradition. He loved trying to preserve it. But there's no, what he was not interested in was preserving tradition in amber, but taking it and turning it into vibrant literature and culture for his readers and for future generations. And that's what I think makes him so lively today, in the same way that it makes all authors lively today. They're aware of the ways in which their work can stretch out into dimensions and areas that they couldn't have imagined to begin with. And that's what's happened with Sholem Aleichem's life and with his legacy. And I'm glad we've gotten the chance to share this with you tonight. So thank you all very, very much for your time and your attention. Thank you.